indeed, they did fund the American Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress, by inflation, by printing up Continental Currency. And there's a famous quote by one of the members of and this is going to be only an approximate quote, one of the members of Congress, and he said, "Why should I consent to load my constituents with taxes when we can send to the printer for a wagon load of money and pay for it with but a quire," meaning just a few sheets of it. So they all thought, hey, this is great, right? Just print it up. And so, indeed, and of course, they had legal tender laws. You had to accept it. And so you had instances during the inflation when, of course, the paper money had fallen to $1 and paper money was worth very much less than $1 in silver. You actually had debtors seeking to force their creditors to pay off the debt in this money. And you had cases, funny, but the poor lender running out the back door of his house to avoid, having to take this bunch of depreciated paper in return for the very real money that he previously had loaned the guy. There's terrible inflation, like 1,000% inflation during that period. And the first American economist, Pelatiah Webster, in his book on this and similar things, talks about seeing a sailor drunk in a suit made entirely of continental notes. Somebody had sewed together a suit of clothes and paper money, and that's about what it was worth at the end. And however, some people, as in all these inflations, benefit from it, especially the people emitting the notes. And you're right that Hamilton wanted that in the Constitution. They didn't put it in the Constitution. Of course, there was a very unfortunate, I think there are a number of things wrong with the Constitution, and this is one of them, a very unfortunate compromise. So while the states are forbidden from emitting bills of credit or from making anything a legal tender except gold or silver, Congress is not forbidden from that. And the good guys in the Constitutional Convention wanted to forbid Congress from being able to do that. So this was a deliberate compromise to allow a loophole, which, of course, Hamilton immediately wanted them to take advantage of.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is forbidden in the sense that it's not in Article 1, Section 8, and the 10th Amendment was ratified.
I know, but I mean, at the Constitutional Convention, this was all discussed, and the compromise was they wouldn't address it. Remember that the 10 Amendments came later, and they were forced into that by the Anti-Federalists.
Right. Yeah, I remember Jefferson, in a letter to George Washington, I think, said that if you do this, not only is central banking a bad idea for all the reasons I've just outlined above, and it's a bad plan to do this, but beyond that, you're George Washington, the first president, and you will be setting the precedent, and I think he said you'll be stepping foot onto a boundless field of power from which there will never be any return.
Yeah, and of course Washington had no problem with doing that, and neither have his subsequent people. And by the way, it was sort of the 18th century version of the current ripoff, that you had all the bonds that had been issued by the Continental Congress. They didn't issue just paper money, but they issued bonds that had been bought up by wealthy speculators at just a cent or two on the dollar. And then Hamilton immediately argued for redeeming them at par and taxing everybody else in order to redeem these his pals in Philadelphia and elsewhere who had bought up these bonds at the depreciated price, and then wanted. And he did bring that about. There was this ripoff, sort of an early version of the Wall Street bailout.
Yeah, I remember also reading a letter from Jefferson, I think, to Madison, explaining that he saw Hamilton on the steps of, I guess, the Capitol in Philadelphia and had a big argument with him and concluded that Hamilton's trip to England, I'm not certain which trip that was, but whatever trip it was that he took to England completely infected him with all these ideas, and with the idea especially that being in debt to the English would be a great way to keep the peace between the two, or something like that. And so that basically he's just hopeless, James. I don't know what we're going to do. I think I'm going to resign.
Tom DiLorenzo, the author of the great books that have overthrown the idol Abraham Lincoln, has a new book coming out in October on Hamilton. And one of the things that he ascribes to Hamilton is, of course, he's the father of central banking, is the father of the Federal Reserve, father of much else evil and centralized power and government of, by, and for the plutocracy and many of the other things that we see today. But I've not read this book yet, but knowing Tom, I'm sure it's a brilliant demolition of Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, and the founding father of a lot of evil.
Mm-hmm. Now, you brought up Lincoln there, but we don't want to get to him yet because I still want to know what you know about the Jefferson and Madison and maybe even Monroe eras and how they dealt with the central bank that Hamilton had created. And then we got to discuss Andrew Jackson and his war against Francis Biddle.
Well, and, as you know, the War of 1812 was funded by the first American central bank, and there was a vast inflation. There was a depression after that, a panic as they called it in those days. In fact, the Panic of 1813 is the title of Murray Rothbard's PhD dissertation that he did on this first big-scale American business cycle caused by paper money inflation and central banking. And but eventually the thing was abolished by Andrew Jackson. I'm not a fan of Andrew Jackson in most things. He was a big centralizer. During his administration, you had the so-called nullification crisis when he passed a huge tax increase, in those days a tariff increase, and you had lots of people resisting it, and the state of South Carolina said, we're not going to pay the tariff, and that we have the right as a state, and building upon the Kentucky and Virginia resolves that Jefferson and Madison had written in the 18th century, said we're not going to allow you to collect the tariff in our state. So you may have your guys at Fort Sumter and everything, they're not. So you had Jackson threatening to start a war and to invade South Carolina to make them pay the tariff. And it's a very interesting pre-Civil War situation that was exactly like the Civil War except minus slavery. We were told that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. Well, here was this exact same thing going on because Jackson was a big slaveholder. He sounds like Lincoln if you read what Jackson is saying. So I'm no Jacksonian.
He's also the guy that helped the Georgians do the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma too.
I was just going to say he was responsible for the ethnic cleansing of the Indians from the state of Georgia, rather than doing what the good guys at the time recommended. So why don't we allow them to have their own state? Just have in effect an Indian secession from Georgia and let them be a state. Well, of course, Jackson's choice was, again, this murderous, sent the army down, and many, many thousands and thousands of people died, and what as you say, is called the Trail of Tears, forced by soldiers to march at speeds faster than they really should have been, all the way to Oklahoma, where, of course, they were to later be dispossessed again once the oil was discovered. But, yeah, Jackson...
this monster, he took on the central bank.
All these presidents, they all got their problems. We've never had a situation in which we were freer after some guy's tenure in office than before he got in. Never in American history. Every single president has left the government bigger and more powerful than he found it. So it's with maybe the exception of William Henry Harrison, my favorite president, who died right after he was inaugurated. So I guess I can say that he didn't do that. However, Jackson hated the central bank, and he wanted to abolish it, and there was a huge political fight, all kinds of bribes, all kinds of tremendous propaganda in the newspapers, smearing Jackson's wife, and all kinds of, they're willing to do anything to keep the game going, but he vetoed the bill, and he wouldn't allow the bank to be continued, and he set up what was called the sub-treasury system, where the U.S. Treasury had offices in various cities for deposit of gold and so forth. Not an ideal situation, but not a central bank. So it's a wonderful thing he did, and it wasn't until Lincoln's national currency system and Lincoln's vast paper money inflation with the greenbacks that we had the beginnings of not quite central banking, but some aspects of central banking, and of certainly monetary depreciation for the benefit of the military contractors and the government, just as usual.
Right.